Because it's Giving Tuesday and we're a very small nonprofit, and every bit counts, especially as the teaching of LGBTQ history throughout the country is under ever increasing threat. If you'd like and are able to donate, no amount is too small. We do have a donation page on our website, and I think we'll even drop that donate page in the chat. So our project, the New York City LGBT Historic Sites Project, we've been around almost 10 years now. And in that time, we've been hard at work documenting LGBTQ history, where it happened, and where it's still happening throughout the city's 5 boroughs, and with our earliest site dating to the 17th century. It's a really important record of the LGBTQ community's contributions to American history and culture so that these stories may never be forgotten. And this is a snapshot of the map on our website. You can filter the map several ways, as you see on the left, and click on any pin to learn about a range of diverse stories. You can also explore this history through a variety of thematic collections we've created on the website. These are just 9 of the 40 or so examples, including on the right here, you see one connected to the AIDS crisis. We're historic preservationists, so another aspect of our work is to increase LGBTQ representation on the National Register of Historic Places, which is the federal government's honorary list of places that tell the story of America. Queer and trans sites remain vastly underrepresented around the country, though our work has led to the listing of 11 sites and 1 historic district, that's Greenwich Village in New York City, and we're currently working on 2 more. Some of the other ways we make this history accessible are through free self-guided walking tours available on the Bloomberg Connects app. We give walking tours often in June, public tours like this one at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. And every now and then we have a plaque unveiling like this one at Julius's in Greenwich Village, and that is Randy Wicker, who took part in the historic sit-in in 1966. A lot of people know us best from our Instagram feed, where we share snippets of the city's LGBTQ history, and these reels are some examples of our recent work in the past half year or so. And tonight's talk, Silence Equals Death, Reclaiming the Pink Triangle in AIDS-Era New York, is the 3rd virtual program we're hosting this fall as part of our intergenerational speaker series, The Historian and the Activist, Cross-Cultural LGBTQ New York. Our first 2 programs focusing on queer, Irish, and Puerto Rican histories are now up on our YouTube channel if you didn't get a chance to see those. And as always, we want to thank Humanities New York with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, whose action grant made this free series possible. And before we hear from tonight's guest speakers, I wanted to give a very quick overview of just some of the historic places we've mapped connected to the AIDS epidemic. These include the residences of influential AIDS activists, like Larry Kramer's apartment at 2 Fifth Avenue. The Gay Men's Health Crisis, GMHC, was founded here in August of 1981, a month after a New York Times article reported a, quote, rare cancer seen in 41 homosexuals. And Kramer was also later a founder of ACT UP, and you see him wearing his Silence Equals Death shirt here. We've also mapped medical facilities like the former St. Vincent's Hospital in Greenwich Village, which became ground zero of the AIDS epidemic in New York City. And in 1984, the 7th floor of the Spelman Building, which you see here, became the first and largest AIDS ward on the East Coast. The facade is the only part of the building that wasn't demolished following its conversion to luxury housing over 10 years ago, which is a complicated story we dive into further on the website. Queer spaces impacted by AIDS include the St. Mark's Baths, a popular gay bathhouse in the East Village, which was closed 39 years ago this very week in 1985, the year that the city's health department closed nearly all gay bathhouses due to what it considered high-risk sexual activities. And popular gay clubs like the Saint and the Paradise Garage ultimately closed because many of its patrons had died of AIDS. We've also documented the stories of influential queer artists, activists, writers, and many others who died of AIDS-related illnesses, which, really showing the toll of the epidemic. Just three examples are the Chelsea residences of Osato Saint and Vito Russo, and Keith Haring's Greenwich Village Art Studio. And of course, we acknowledge the many people who we don't know their names in other sites as well. Finally, we've mapped several ACT UP demonstrations on Wall Street targeting the pharmaceutical companies profiteering from the AIDS epidemic. You see images here of a 1988 demonstration in front of Trinity Church and another a year later in front of the New York Stock Exchange. And there you see the Pink Triangle there on the New York City landscape, which is a great transition to our guest speakers tonight. First, Dr. Jake Newsome is an award-winning scholar of German and American LGBTQ plus history, whose research and resources educate global audiences. He is the founder and director of the Pink Triangle Legacies Project, a grassroots initiative that honors the memory of the Nazis' queer victims and carries on their legacy by fighting homophobia and transphobia today through education, empowerment, and advocacy. Jake is the author of Pink Triangle Legacies, Coming Out in the Shadow of the Holocaust, which traces the transformation of the Pink Triangle from a Nazi concentration camp badge into a global symbol of LGBTQ plus pride. He lives with his husband and son in San Diego. And Avram Finkelstein is an artist, writer, and a founding member of the Silence Equals Death and Grand Fury collectives. His book, After Silence, A History of AIDS Through Its Images, was nominated for the 30th Annual Lambda Literary Award in LGBTQ Nonfiction and an International Center of Photography 2018 Infinity Award in Critical Writing and Research. Avram's work has shown at numerous museums and galleries, including the Cooper Hewitt and David Zwirner, and is in the permanent collection of MoMA, the Whitney, the New Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Brooklyn Museum, the Smithsonian, the Fogg Museum, the Getty Institute, and the Victoria and Albert Museum.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Amanda. And thanks for all of you for logging on this evening. As Amanda referenced, I'm going to give a very brief overview of the history of the Pink Triangle. And then Avram and I are going to have a conversation about the particular manifestation of this Pink Triangle and the famous Silence Equals Death poster. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And like any good historian, we'll be starting the story way back even before the beginning. In the 15 years before the Nazis came to power, Germany was a democracy, and LGBTQ Germans had built the most progressive, dynamic, and visible emancipation movement that the world had seen up to that point. But during these democratic years, the Nazi Party was trying to move itself, reposition itself from being a small right-wing party on the fringe of politics and transform itself into a formidable player on the national stage. And so in order to do this, they also ramped up their homophobic and transphobic rhetoric by claiming that LGBTQ folks were trying to, quote, corrupt Germany's youth and children and seduce them into what they called the homosexual lifestyle. And they knew that this kind of propaganda would rile up their base and would unite voters on the right who might not otherwise agree with the Nazi platform on other issues. And it worked. Now, the Nazis believed that out of the LGBTQ community, it was queer men who posed the most dangerous threat because in Germany, like most other countries around the world at the time, it was men who had access to positions of power. Right? It was men who led the military, who led the economy, and national politics. So the Nazis' campaign against homosexuality really focused primarily on hunting down and rooting out men who had sex with men. But they also did arrest and torture queer women and trans people when they appeared on their radar. So the Nazis had used a very specific law against queer men, but the Nazis also got creative and used a number of different laws to prosecute lesbians and trans folks. And because the Nazis didn't believe that people were born gay or born trans, their policies against LGBTQ folks were, at least officially, to cure them and then reintegrate them back into society. Now, when someone was sent to a concentration camp, they were assigned a color-coded triangle badge that indicated their so-called crime. And the Nazis arrested about 100,000 queer men and sent somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 of them to the camps where they were marked with a pink triangle badge, like the one you see here. And because Nazis didn't recognize transgender identities as legitimate, they often treated trans women as, quote, cross-dressing homosexual men. And so it is clear that some of these prisoners who were marked with the pink triangle badge were certainly trans women. So there was no separate category or separate distinct category for queer women or trans prisoners, and they were often marked with a black triangle. This was a miscellaneous category that the Nazis used to mark so-called asocials or social deviants, which was a category that the Nazis used to include folks like unhoused people, sex workers, people struggling with alcoholism, and even what the Nazis called chronically unemployed. Now, there aren't any records indicating why the Nazis chose pink for queer prisoners. At that time in Germany, pink was still a boy's color because it was a lighter shade of red, which was seen as a masculine color. And one theory is that one of the things we know is that at the time, a popular slang term for a male sex worker who had sex with men was in German Rosa-Rota, which translates to English as like pinkies or rosies. And so it's certain that Nazi law enforcement officials were aware of this term, and that's perhaps why they chose pink for the badge for homosexuals. We know because of the records that ultimately two-thirds of Pink Triangle prisoners were killed in the Nazi concentration camps. Now, after the war was over, the Allies transferred many of the Pink Triangle survivors to local prisons to serve out the rest of their prison sentence. And the Allies, including the Americans, also let German authorities, both in West Germany and in East Germany, keep and indeed use the Nazi version of the national anti-gay law for decades after the end of the Holocaust. Now, in the early 1970s, a political gay liberation movement emerged in democratic West Germany, pretty much alongside the development of a nationally coordinated movement here in the United States. And activists in this new movement sought to mobilize queer people into political action across the nation. And at this time, both in Germany and the United States as well, coming out and publicly claiming an LGBTQ identity was not just a personal decision, but it was also a political strategy. In the past, activists had argued really for the right to privacy. So essentially, they had argued that the government should not prosecute or persecute LGBTQ folks as long as they stayed in the privacy and indeed the safety of the metaphorical closet. But the politics of coming out, on the other hand, asserted that citizens in a democratic society had the right to express their sexuality freely and openly without fear of reprisal. So West German gay activists suggested that they all collectively out themselves by deciding to wear a gay symbol out in public. And this all raised a lot of questions, primarily what symbol could they agree on would be the gay symbol. Well, in 1972, a publisher in Hamburg released a short book that would come to have a monumental impact. It was written under the pseudonym Heinz Hager, and it was the very first book written by a gay concentration camp survivor to tell their story. And the title of the book, which in English translates to The Men with the Pink Triangle, offered a solution to this problem of visibility. Right? So activists there knew that West Germans would instantly recognize the pink triangle as a concentration camp symbol and thus be faced with this fact that their recent history wasn't really completely in the past yet. So in March of 1972, a leftist radical group in Frankfurt, Germany called Rot-Schwul became the very first organization in the world to reclaim the pink triangle and use it as a symbol of gay liberation. Now, these West German gay activists knew that their reclamation of the pink triangle represented, yes, a fundamental transformation of a symbol, but also the transformation of an identity. Because the original pink triangle had labeled being gay as something that was criminal or worth punishing. But these activists reclaimed it and asserted that being gay was in no longer in any way shameful. And so they tried to rob that symbol of its negative power by saying that, you know what, being gay is not an insult anymore. And in fact, we're going to wear this symbol as a badge of pride. Now, the reclamation of the pink triangle originated in West Germany, but it didn't stay there for very long. In August of 1974, the Gay Activists Alliance in New York City planned a rally in support of a gay rights bill, and they designed and wore these buttons that you can see here on the screen. And that was the very first documented instance of the pink triangle's use in political activism in the United States. And so from there, it spread across the nation. LGBTQ activists used the pink triangle and the history that it represented to call out homophobia and to promote equality. And they did so from New York to Miami, DC, San Francisco, and then everywhere in between. And in America, too, these gay activists understood their use of the pink triangle as a transformation of something negative into something that was powerfully positive. And the Jewish and lesbian activist Martha Shelley told me in an interview that the pink triangle also had the added benefit of giving the middle finger to the Nazis. By the early 1980s, the pink triangle had become the most widely used symbol of gay rights activism across North America and Europe. And it resonated with communities from multiple ethnicities and backgrounds and from various gender identities and sexual orientations. But in 1978, another LGBTQ symbol was about to be born, and this time in San Francisco. Several activists, including Harvey Milk, felt that the pink triangle was too firmly anchored in a history of victimhood, and it could never be truly reclaimed. And so they wanted a new symbol that the LGBTQ community could take pride in. And what Lynn Sagerblom, James McNamara, and Gilbert Baker designed was the first rainbow flag. Two of their flags were raised and flown over the United Nations Plaza during San Francisco Gay Freedom Day in June of 1978. Now, the pink triangle, or the rainbow flag and the pink triangle coexisted for many years, but eventually the rainbow became the predominant symbol of the LGBTQ community across the globe. And perhaps that transition is something we can talk about during the Q&A. But I want to bring us to the topic at hand tonight, which was in 1986, a group of 6 artists and activists in New York City began meeting during the AIDS crisis. And what came out of their meeting was a poster that is to this day one of the most evocative symbols of a social movement in history. And so we are lucky to have one of those designers of the Silence Equals Death poster with us here this evening. And so it's my honor to introduce Avram Finkelstein. And Avram and I are, we have several topics that we want to discuss. And as Amanda said at the beginning, if you have questions for Avram or myself, you can ask them in the chat. We've got time saved at the end for Q&A. So Avram, thanks for joining us here for this conversation. It's a really great chance for everyone to learn about the history of this important symbol. And I want to take us back maybe to the beginning, right? It's 1986. You and a group start meeting in New York. So I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about that. So where were you meeting, and what were those meetings like? And really, at what point did you all decide that you either wanted or needed to take action?
So thanks for that fantastic, comprehensive introduction. You have saved me a lot of work. The man I was building my life around started showing signs of immunosuppression in 1981, 81, and was dead by 1984. So, because I come from a political family and have been a lifelong activist, and everyone in my family are activists in various political causes, it occurred to me that we might want to form a collective. I met with uh, two friends for dinner. I actually had dinner with one friend, and he brought someone else. And the three of us, and this would have been in 1985. It was basically a condolence call from Jorge Sakaras, and he brought uh, a friend of his who I did not know, and the three of us uh, began a conversation. And in the middle of the dinner, I started to realize we couldn't be the only ones who felt like we needed a space to talk about AIDS. So I suggested that we form a collective loosely based on feminist organizing principles, the consciousness raising collective. And because the way consciousness raising is most effective is if there's some tension. In other words, it's not a group of friends, we don't all know each other, that um, creates the possibility for questions and growth. So I suggested that the three of us, Oliver Johnston was the friend that Jorge had brought with him to dinner. I suggested we each invite one person the other two did not know. Um, and we formed a consciousness raising collective, not with the idea of making a poster and not necessarily with the idea of expressing our political agency, but it became very quickly obvious to me that every conversation we met for dinner once a week and we all brought dishes. It was like a classic lesbian potluck, but six gay men. And we would start out talking about our anxieties and about loneliness and our fears, but almost every week we would end up talking about politics. People started bringing press clippings about things that were happening with regard to AIDS. And because I come from a political background, I was active in the Student Mobilization Committee and had learned how to silkscreen posters, reproducing the May 68 student strike posters. I was very aware that the way in which people organized uh, during times of strife was using the streets of New York. So I suggested to the collective, why don't we make a poster? We weren't an art collective. We didn't form with the idea of making a poster. And the poster isn't the only thing that we talked about. We talked about all the things I just mentioned, but every week we would spend some time thinking about that, the making of a poster. So in truth, the poster took us 9 months to develop. And in that period, we were getting to know each other. There were tears, there was support, it was intense and wonderful. But it took us 9 months to get to a resolution that led to what ended up being the Silence Equals Death poster.
Perfect. Thanks for providing that background. I remember from one of our previous conversations, you mentioned kind of one of the impetuses or moments was the publication of I guess it was an op-ed or an article by William Buckley Jr. And I'm wondering if you could just tell the audience a little bit about what that op-ed was and how it impacted y'all's group.
So it was an op-ed in the New York Times, a very pernicious op-ed written by William F. Buckley Jr., in which he suggested that people who were HIV positive should be tattooed. Half of the members of the six-person collective are Jewish, so that was something we paid a lot of attention to. And it was it's what kickstarted the idea of what a poster could be. And as we were discussing, okay, well, if we were going to make a poster about that issue, what would the image be on the poster? And I would say one of the members of the collective is a musician. The others were all art directors. So we had ideas about what a poster might look like. And as we discussed the questions raised by the William F. Buckley op-ed, which was going to be what the poster was about, we started to think, okay, well, if we depict a tattoo, what gender is the body that tattoo is on? What race is the body of that tattoo is on? And immediately started to realize we couldn't use a photographic image because people of color and women were also being impacted by AIDS, and that was very clear from the beginning for people who were politically engaged. So we decided that it would have to be pictographic, and that began this process of testing out different ideas and rejecting them. We were going to use the rainbow flag, but we felt like it didn't have the gravitas. It wasn't, I mean, it does have gravitas, but we felt like it was hippie-ish and didn't live up to what we were trying to do. And we rejected it almost immediately. Actually, the very first idea we had was a pink triangle, but rejected it for exactly the same reason you described about that led to the development of the rainbow flag, which is the intonation of victimhood. So we thought of the pink triangle, we rejected it, then we tossed around the idea of the rainbow flag, rejected that. We were going to use a labyrinth, but we thought, well, the women will know what that is, but a lot of men wouldn't know what that was. We tried on all of these symbols, and in the conversation, we realized that was part of the problem for organizing politically around AIDS, was that there was no agreed upon idea of what represented us. So we ended up coming back to the pink triangle because of all the things. Again, we were all art directors, so we had very definite ideas about what would look good. Of all of the things that seemed like it might be most recognizable uh, and closest to what we were trying to say, we ended up with the pink triangle.
You know, one of the parts of your book that really stood out to me, and if y'all have not gotten a copy or read it yet, I definitely recommend Avram's book After Silence. But you talked about wanting the poster to be able to do, of course, multiple things, but one of those was, on the one hand, mobilize the queer and trans community into action, but at the same time trying to essentially convince straight society that that the community was already mobilized. And so having to do both of these things at the same time, and it makes me think, as listening to you talk about the need for something pictographic, something, I think you've talked about it in another interview, maybe or in one of our chats, about as being a kind of a visual soundbite. And it made me think, like, this is right before the era of hashtags, and digital movement making and social media. And so really this is kind of that same the same challenges of being able to convey really complex a multitude of stories in something that's got to be short, quick, and get people's attention.
I think the reason why it's considered efficacious to the extent that it is, there's a large part of the world that's never seen it or heard of Silence Equals Death, doesn't know anything about it. So I'm not suffering under the delusion that it has more power than people have ascribed to it. But it really was viral marketing
Mm.
prior to Madison Avenue using that idea. And if ACT UP hadn't formed just as the poster was going up in the streets of New York City, it could have come and gone in the night and you never would have heard of it. It's only through the agency of all of the many activists who were involved with ACT UP who deployed that as an image and supported it through organizing uh, public health projects, uh, going after the FDA, the CDC, all of those things are what this has become a symbol for. This is the soundbite for. This represents. So I think in a way, it really is, it preceded the idea of viral marketing, but it was the exact same postmodern set of gestures that led to the rise of the internet, the ways in which we think about social spaces to this day. Those were the ideas that were brewing in New York at the time, and they fed into the poster. And I would, to go back to the conversation about the CR group and why the consciousness raising group and why the poster took so long to make, I believe that part of the efficacy of it is every tear, every argument, every fear that went into our weekly conversations is woven into that poster in a way. It was authentic to us and ended up articulating something that was authentic to many people.
Absolutely. And I want to come back to it in just a moment, kind of the what you mentioned about the agency of all these different activists and also the contingency of these multiple factors coming together at that point in time. So we've talked about the use of the pink triangle itself on the poster, right? But of course the other I guess kind of really big component of the poster is the slogan "Silence equals death." And so I'm wondering if you could walk folks through how y'all came to use that slogan as well.
So I will say that for those of you who consider propaganda to be a negative thing, I consider myself a propagandist. I think propaganda is communication. It can be used for good. It can be used for destructively. Um, Part of communicating effectively, I believe, is the right combination of not just images. We do live in an image culture, but if you think about it, the internet is text-based. In fact, it was the Department of Defense that funded what we have come to understand as the internet. It always originally was text-based. And if you think about it, as you're texting your friends, text is as much a component of a visual landscape as images are. So it was very clear to us that there needed to be text. And the startling thing about this historiography, and I started out by saying we worked on it for 9 months, the phrase silence equals death happened in a volley that was so fast, it was literally 3 minutes. I had, in the New York Times, I had written in my, I'm a note taker, I had written in my journal something that I saw in an article of the Times, and it was in the Times, and it was something about silence being deafening. And it is, of course, a complete cliche, but it was 1985 and 1986. It was the first time I saw it, and I made a note of it. And as we were having our last meeting prior to the holidays, which was at Jorge's house, I even remember what he cooked. He was macrobiotic, so it was a vegan stew of some sort. So as we're waiting for the food to heat up, I pulled out my notebook and I said, I saw this quote. What about silence is deafening? And someone else, and I have reconstructed it in the book, and I think it's fairly accurate. Uh, Someone else said immediately, "Oh no, it should be silence is death." And somebody else said immediately in response to that comment, "No, it should be silence equals death." And then someone else shouted, "It should be an equal," because we had spent all this time thinking about pictographs, "it should be an equal sign." And I swear to God, we jumped up and shouted like at that turn of phrase. It was so clear immediately that that was what we were trying to say for 9 months as we were arguing about images and politics and why isn't the queer community organizing around AIDS. It was the perfect text. So I will downshift back to what you were saying earlier. I, as a New Yorker and who has communicated in the streets since I was a teenager, I'm very aware with how of how the streets of New York are used. And a lot of people, New Yorkers are very parochial. We shop in our neighborhood. We use the dry cleaner in our neighborhood. Some At the time, if you lived downtown, you didn't go uptown. People who lived uptown didn't know anything about Greenwich Village. It's like a tiny island, but New Yorkers are parochial. It's the way in which we manage the amount of people who we come into contact with. We make communities within communities. So there are people who use the street, and I had this idea that there are two lines of text, didactic text across the bottom that are small. You have to step up to the poster to look at it. And then there's that gigantic text of silence equals death, which I had this idea. I should say, I proposed it as a design problem to the collective. It had to be read from a moving vehicle. That's for people from the outer boroughs, people who take buses, people who drive into the city. We have this pejorative phrase, bridge and tunnel people, if you're a Manhattanite, like people who come in from the outlying areas, we refer to as bridge and tunnel people. We wanted to be able to imply a level of organization and more specifically, funding. We wanted to imply that there was a lot of power behind this poster. It was just six of us. It was a sleight of hand and part of the my upbringing because I was a teenager in the 60s. I thought about the Yippies a lot, Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman. And they were like tricksters. Part of the way in which they conceived of political activism was through humor, through tricks, through lies. We live in a culture where lies are very much a part of the way power structures are organized. So it was this very specific idea of not making a wheat pasted poster that was Xerox that we would put up ourselves, but actually high production values printed on a web press, not a web press, uh, an offset press, and on glossy paper and be large and wheat pasted alongside ads for perfumes, ads for fashion, ads for movies, to imply a level of funding and to insert a political message where you didn't expect to see it. So that's how it ended up being bifurcated. The This is an image that I sent to Jake today. This is a photograph of how it appeared in situ. And in fact, my mother I lived on 42nd Street at the time, and my mother came to visit me and saw the poster. It wasn't, this isn't the 42nd Street postering, but she saw it on the way to my house. And when she got there and I told her about the project, she said, my mother was very didactic herself. She said, "Oh my God, you did that. It's like the shot heard around the world," which is very typical of the sort of exaggerated political thought that my mother was capable of. She understood it in a way that I didn't yet understand it, because in fact, ACT UP had yet to be formed when the poster was going up.
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of folks aren't aware of. They associate, right, the poster with ACT UP and kind of assume that it was ACT UP that also created it. And in reality, right, it was your group, and then was adopted by ACT UP a few, if I'm not mistaken, a few months later there in 1987. Um, Ibram, I saw a question come in through the chat that I had wanted to ask. And so I think it's a good transition here is that if we look at, and I think I have a comparison if I can get my slides to move, but if we look at the original direction of the pink triangle, right, the peak is pointing down, and when we look then right at the silence equals death poster, and the peak is facing upwards. And so I'm wondering if you could talk to us about the series of events that led to that change in direction.
So it was somewhat accidental, but we now carry archives in our pockets on computers, our smartphones. At the time, in order to research something, you would have to go to something called a library. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those. You would have to go to a library and do academic research. So one of the members of the collective, Chris Leone, who's half German, had been in Dachau and was positive on a business trip shortly before we decided on the Pink Triangle. And he was positive that it was pointing upward. The person who laid out the poster, Oliver Johnston, said he would confirm that and research it, but he did not. So it was a total mistake. One of the tasks that I was assigned, and there were a few of them, was to place it in bars and bookstores around New York. And when I took it to the Different Light bookstore, which is neither of these bookstores are still there. They put it in the window. They didn't think anything of it. When I took it to the Oscar Wilde bookstore on Christopher Street, they said to me, "No, we're not going to put this out because it's ahistoric. The triangle is supposed to point down." And we had already printed the fucking things, and it wasn't free. So I went back to the collective and I said, the triangle is in the wrong direction. Should we reprint the poster, or what should we do about it? And it was in that conversation that we thought, you know what? We weren't going to use the pink triangle because of its intonation of victimhood, and we don't want people with AIDS to think of themselves as victims. And another thing that happened during that period of time that you described so beautifully, Jake, in the 70s was there was this new age spiritual idea of triangles pointing up as a symbol of empowerment. So we were like, we could reprint it, but you know what? We weren't sure about it. And we didn't mean it to be this way, but this is exactly what we were trying to say. So we kept it. We didn't reprint it.
I love it. I mean, it's just one of those beautiful examples of kind of a historical accident that ends up, taking on meaning of its own. And just, I remember learning that from you and almost falling out because there was all this, people debating about, well, clearly they did this or they did that, and
Well, I think that this is the thing about agency and going on the record in public spaces is you don't always know if what you're doing is the right thing to do, but all you can do is express your own agency. And I I was a founding member of the Grand Fury Collective, and Grand Fury was an art collective. The collective likes to think of itself as a political collective, but it was formed around an art museum installation. It was funded by the arts. This was prior to that moment. This was the Silence Equals Death Collective was a political collective. And one of the frailties of Grand Fury that I fortunately or don't unfortunately don't have is I'm not afraid of being wrong. I'm not afraid of an accident. I don't need to be sure of something in order to feel like it might be worth saying. And I think as political activists or organizers or academics, I see there are teachers from all over the world on this Zoom. We think about this sort of thing all the time. And I think the meaning with a capital M is made by individuals being forced into action. And I think that's what this poster is a reflection of.
Absolutely. I absolutely. So we have another question here that and says, well, can you please discuss the partnership with ACT UP, or how did this poster kind of come from y'all's group to then being used by ACT UP?
Okay, so read the book that's over Jake's shoulder. It's a page turner, I promise you. It's not didactic at all. Uh, we met once a week, and the only person who was talking about the politics of AIDS was Larry Kramer. Larry Kramer, at the last minute, was asked to replace Nora Ephron, who was supposed to speak at the Lesbian and Gay Community Center. And at the last minute, she canceled and he replaced her. So I said to the collective, instead of meeting at someone's apartment, why don't we go hear Larry speak? Maybe he will say something that relates to our project. And that was the night that ACT UP was formed. So we immediately we were founding members of ACT UP. We immediately became a part of that organization. And I will say that I had it in my head that we were going to make three posters. This was the first, and we were going to make an intermediate poster and a poster that would call for riots during the 1988 presidential election. And in fact, in my journal, which is in Phil's library, if you want to go there and look at it, you'll see a sketch for that third poster. So I had this idea that we were going to call for radical action. But then ACT UP happened. And I realized, well, no, maybe this is that thing that we were trying to call for. So that's how we ended up being subsumed by it. I paid for the first run of buttons. We sold them at the GMHC AIDS walk. We made $1,000 that day. It paid for the buttons were $1 a piece, but they cost 18 cents to make. And I said, I was sitting next to somebody who suggested at one of the early meetings that we needed a fundraising committee. And the facilitator said, great, so you'll take responsibility for that. And he looked at me, he's like, after the meeting, he was like, I don't know anything about fundraising. I said, I have an idea. The buttons cost 18 cents a piece. I didn't want to, my objective wasn't fundraising. It was to sell 1,000 buttons would mean there were 1,000 more activists in New York that day. So that was my objective. And I think you sort of coalition work is about not always about having a definite idea of what needs to be done, but working with other people who are like-minded to decide what needs to be done. And that's what happened. That's how we became members of ACT UP. And two of the members of the collective were on the outreach committee. They did a lot of the visual work in the early days. I was the first at-large member. I represented the floor at uh, meetings in which we would decide what the agenda would be. So we became completely absorbed in ACT UP.
Perfect. Thank you for helping explain that. And I know we're coming in kind of to the close of the last few minutes. If you've got questions, you can put them in the chat. I do see a question here coming from Avery. I think this is a really good question, especially kind of as we start to wrap up. It says, is there anything that you wish you would have known before getting involved with activism? And that this is, there's a question coming from young queer activists themselves.
So before being involved with ACT UP activism or activism in general?
Well, so it just says activism, but maybe with ACT UP and silence equals death.
Well, I think again, if your frailty is that you need to be right about something in order to do it, then no one would act. So I think the idea of whether I regretted something or wish I had known something, through every single expression of my own agency from the time I was a teenager to the current predicament, which is global, it isn't just about America. I feel as though every gesture is an opportunity to learn something about the world. And I love that about activism. If you don't feel like you need to be right before you act, then you're open to the idea that you could learn something by acting and learn something from other people. And that's the beauty of collective, forming a collective to make a work like Silence Equals Death, or forming a collective like Grand Fury. There's no idea that can't be improved by multiple brains.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think probably a good question, kind of piggybacking off of that, and this comes from, oops, it is zooming out of my chat. Hold on, let me scroll back up. This is coming
Okay,
from.
so I don't want to scold you, Jake, but you had 8 questions. But the audience has really good questions too. So
That's
I was going to
yeah.
say we can
another
extend the
hour, I
time a little
think.
bit if you both would like to, and if they have to go, that's fine. But if you would both like, we can keep it going a bit more since
I do have some extra time. I wanted to go through to make sure that we could get some of the questions from the attendees. And I thought that this was a really good one coming from, I think it's Mika. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. They say that I'm a public health major who has relocated from New York to North Carolina and consider myself a queer activist as well. How would you advise those of us in more rural and conservative parts of the country to persevere through the current political climate today?
Okay, North Carolina is Research Triangle. Like there is so much happening there, so much of the ideas that were funneled into the NIH that led to protease inhibitors and mRNA vaccines, like all of that stuff happens where you are. So if I were in North Carolina, I would, and there wasn't a collective that was working on public health, I would form one. You're in the right place. You're in the right place to uh, for activism, especially now with the people who are being suggested for the NIH, the FDA, and the CDC.
Absolutely. I think that's an important message that we can take away. Regardless of where we live, as you said, there's the power in collective thinking and doing and acting. Well, again, I've got another
Sorry, I
quote.
need to interject here. The So ACT UP Philadelphia was far more radical than ACT UP New York. There are people who know that about AIDS activism, and there are people who don't. But the reason I'm bringing it up here is Philly is a small town relative to Manhattan. There's no international press. Well, there probably is international press in Philly now, but at the time there wasn't. I don't think you should ever let somebody tell you what the obstacle to your agency is. You should do it anyway. Sorry, Jake.
I love it. I love that. Um, well, this is, I think, a good kind of wrap up question, Abram, that I wanted to discuss to get your thoughts on is that, the Pink Triangle, we talked about it, beginning in the 70s was reclaimed, but really in the past decade or so has kind of seen another resurgence. It's been used in Black Lives Matter demonstrations for queer people of color. It's been used by trans organizations for trans rights. ACT UP New York even issued a new silence equals death design with the pink triangle as a watermelon slice in solidarity with Palestinians. And so I'm just wondering, in your opinion, what makes the Pink Triangle so meaningful to so many different groups of people, decades now after it's been reclaimed, and what do you think are some of the Pink Triangle's lessons for us in America today?
That's a very big question if you think we're ending on it. I think that the way in which it still has meaning was catapulted by the not just thousands, hundreds of thousands of activists who have deployed that image. I think that we made something, but its meaning was defined by the people who responded to its call. So I think that so long as people are, sorry, my pharmacy is texting me. As so long as people are using an image, it doesn't fall out of use. And I think its meaning is made by whomever is using it or however it's being used. In Black Lives Matter, it was silence, white silence is violence, or white silence equals violence. We loaned a phrase to the world that's adaptable. The reason my mother thought it was the shot heard around the world is she could see how layered it was in terms of its potential meanings. It was not meant to have one meaning. And in fact, Doug Crimp, who is gone now, but was started October magazine, got into a public fight with, was it Lee Edelman, was like wrote a critique of silence equals death as being vague. Like, how could this have meaning? It's so vague. And Doug was like, that's exactly why it has meaning. It is open-ended. And again, there were those two modifying lines of text on the bottom that talked about research in America, talked about the presidency, talked about religion. It was two lines of text that implied all the levels of meaning that were going into the AIDS crisis. And then the last line of text was vote, boycott, use your power. I should know, I should know what it says, but I think we make meaning by how we use images and text. We make meaning with our own agency as activists. And now more than ever is the time to express and articulate your agency. If you don't have a political group in your area, form one. There were six of us that made that poster. ACT UP didn't exist. And it wouldn't have mattered if ACT UP didn't come along. We would have gone on the record about something that had meaning to us, meaning with a capital M. And in life, you can't hope for more than that.
Absolutely perfect. Abram, I know I speak for everyone on the call when we just want to say thanks for the six of y'all, to all the work that you did, and you ultimately just had this ripple effect all across the world. And thanks for logging on tonight, for sharing your insight and experience with all of us. It has just been one of the highlights and honor of my work, both as a historian but also as a gay man who has been able to build a life, um, a good, happy life because of the work of people like you. And so this is, like I said, it's exciting for me as a historian, but also just personally to be able to say thanks to you and to others who've made our life today possible. Well, I just want to thank the NYC LGBT Historic Site Program. And thanks to everyone for logging on. I want to turn it back over to Amanda to see if you have any closing comments or thoughts.
And no, just to thank you both, Jake and Avram, for this talk. It was really interesting, as some people have been saying in the chat. There's also an interest of the apartment where the poster was designed, to have that recognized in some way. And I said I know I mentioned this in a previous meeting, that I would love to map it on our website. So perhaps that's something we can discuss afterward, because it is such a great story, and it's great to the information you shared tonight, to have that out there.
Sorry, one last thought. Ira Sachs made a film called Last Address that is about, if you don't know about it, or people on the Zoom don't know about it, it does exactly what you're referring to. It talks about the last place where people lived.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've also worked with visual aids in the past. We're currently to access their records. For those who that have permission to know that these were artists who died of AIDS, we've worked with them to try to map those addresses as well. And yeah, and so we've shared that link in the chat. And yeah, this has been really enlightening, and just really amazing to hear about the transformation of the Pink Triangle. I have Jake's book here and have used it actually on our website to include some information about it. And we actually want to map that first documented use of the Pink Triangle by the Gay Activist Alliance in the early 70s on north of Union Square. So that's something we want to do. Yeah, so I just thank you so much. This is such a timely discussion, although I think it's always relevant. And it's really great that we could have you both here. And again, I just want to thank Humanities New York for supporting our work. And thank you all for joining tonight. If you don't already, we would love it if you'd follow us on social media, NYC LGBT sites, Instagram, Facebook, and soon to be Blue Sky. And also follow Avram and Jake, the great work that they're doing. Thank you so much, everyone. If you have additional questions that you didn't get out tonight, info@nyclgbtsites.org. I should have put that on there somewhere, but feel free to contact us, and we can follow up with any questions that you may have. And if you have sites that you'd like for us to map. So thank you so much, and have a great evening.